All right, so welcome back to part two of the lecture. So, as we discussed in the previous week, we talked about how identity is not fully formed, it's in the process of formation, and that the identities are often usual are are almost always attached to one's locale. And a good example of this is the emergence of what is called the later three kingdoms. So we are still talking about unified Shilla, but what happens at some point is that we have the emergence in this area of what was formerly Pekche, these local warlords that start coalescing, and they form what is called later Pekche. So obviously they still have ties to Pekche, and they do not consider themselves really to be Shilla people. And we see the same thing happening in the northern area. So this area here, which was formerly Koryo, we see local warlords that are emerging, and again they coalesce and they form what is to be called later Koryo. So this is a really good example to show that even although we have centuries that pass, hundreds of years that have passed, these people still do not consider themselves to be Shilla or Korean. They consider themselves still to be Baekje people and Goguryeo people, and that Shilla is a different entity. And so we have this emergence. This comes from around the early 9th century on, and what happens is that we have patriarchs that are these powerful patriarchs within these provinces, and they are joined by central aristocrats. And so these are Shilla people, and because of the power struggles that emerge within Shilla, some people are pushed out of power and excluded from power. And so when they are pushed out of power, they join up with these local aristocrats in these areas. And what follows is that they're able to amass a great amount of wealth for themselves, including land holding. And then when you have sort of like drifting peasants or slaves that are trying to escape, then they are taken in and incorporated into these areas. And so we have the consolidation of these powers, and they eventually evolve into what is called later Baekje and later Goguryeo. We also have up here in the north this area called Pare. Again, because Shilla was unable to incorporate all of the former Goguryeo territories, we have some Goguryeo people that had moved up into this area, and there's a mixture of Goguryeo people and then also Mongol people that form this territory here. So we have, as you know, the Sui dynasty and followed by the Tang dynasties, and then we have this later Shilla here, which is after they've defeated Baekje and Goguryeo, and then we have the later three kingdoms, so Shilla, which is now contracted into this, what was their original territory, and then the formation of later Baekje and later Goguryeo. So this is what we have at the end of the Shilla dynasty. Now, there's one particular person who emerges from this, sorry about the text, but there's one particular person who emerges, and this is this person called Wangan. And he emerges from the later Goguryeo area, specifically the city of Kaesong. He himself is based out of Gangwon Island, but he is a military person, and he rises through the ranks through various battles and his courage and whatnot, and eventually is made king of later Goguryeo in 918. So he renames his state Koryo, which is, he believes, a successor to the Goguryeo dynasty. And the name Koryo is an abbreviated or condensed version of Goguryeo. So he establishes the Koryo dynasty and moves his capital to Kaesong. Now, why would he move his capital there? Well, since he already has a power base there and has emerged from these local aristocrats who support him, he has an automatic power base. So this is why he moves his capital to Kaesong. And because of this, he's able to form strong ties with the local gentry and the local powerful people in that area. All right, so when we look at these later three kingdoms, Koryo was friendly with Shilla, but not so much with later Baekje. So Koryo began to pursue a policy of friendship with Shilla. Later Baekje had at some point invaded Shilla and killed the Shilla king. So Wangun personally led military forces into later Baekje to punish later Baekje for doing this. And so Shilla was very thankful to Koryo for doing this, and then won the admiration of the Shilla people. But we see that these continued hostilities, they persist between Koryo and later Baekje. And what happens in terms of foreign relations is that Koryo, they form ties with whatever entities are up here in northern China, and later Baekje forms ties with whatever down here in southern China. So at this point, by the time we get to the 10th century, the Tang dynasty has fallen. So again, this historical pattern of the rise and fall of dynasties, we see this happening again. And so China has now descended or degenerated into, all of the breakup of all of these different states. So again, another good example of how one's identities and loyalties are focused on the locale. So we have all of these different entities that emerge, and Koryo is friendly with these guys up here, and Baekje has a lot of interaction with these guys down here. And so with these hostilities that occur between Koryo and later Baekje, they begin to intensify into the 10th century. And Koryo is able to really start to put pressure on later Baekje, and they are defeated by Koryo. So if we look at the decline of Baekje, it's due to a number of reasons, not only because of their military losses, but because we have internal disorder within Baekje. One of these being the succession struggle. So the king of later Baekje, he had designated his fourth son to succeed him. So as you can imagine, sons 1, 2, and 3 were not very happy about this. And so the eldest son then imprisons his father. This is the king of later Baekje. He imprisons his father, but the father escapes, and Gyeonghwan escapes to Koryo. And he goes to Koryo, and then he plots revenge against his son. So with this kind of internal disorder, accompanied by military losses, it's not surprising that later Baekje eventually falls. So in 935, Shilla surrenders to Koryo. In 936, later Baekje surrenders to Koryo. Pare had already fallen to the Khitans in 926. So when Koryo is able to unify the peninsula, they look back at what Shilla had done and they say, you know what, we can learn from the mistakes of Shilla. So Wangan, because he understood that, well, you know, people still, they have these regional alliances and they never really felt like they were Shilla people. We need to change this somehow. So in order to do this, he welcomed Shilla royalty. He married a woman from the Shilla royal house. So this was his way of incorporating Shilla. And he also started to form marriage ties with the powerful aristocrats across the country. So these were strategic alliances that he made, and all in all, he took on 20 wives for himself. So these were all marriage alliances with very powerful gentry families throughout the country. We also see from the beginning of Koryo, again, centralization of the bureaucracy. So what we have is, it's basically a warlord coalition because there are all these local warlords that had supported Wangan and his rise to power. There's a military council, but what we see also happening in tandem is the emergence of a new aristocracy. And this new aristocracy is developed as Wangan attempts to strengthen the throne and to elevate the kingship. So one way that he does this is to try to directly control the countryside. This is an enduring problem throughout the dynasty because we have local officials who don't want to give up their power to the central government officials. And so there's a power struggle between the central government and the local governments. But throughout the beginning of the Koryo dynasty, there are a series of kings that attempt to strengthen the throne. So, for example, King Hwanjong, who was the fourth king, he ruled from 949 to 975. In 956, he enacts the Slave Review Act. And this act released all slaves who had been unjustly captured and who were formerly commoners. Now, why would he do this? He did this because slaves don't pay taxes. Commoners pay taxes, but slaves do not. And so when you release these slaves and you give them commoner status, now you've increased the tax revenue base. He also did this because slaves are the property of aristocrats. And it's a part, this property and their owning of slaves is a big part of their wealth. So if you want to reduce the power of the aristocrats, you have to take away their slaves. And so by freeing up these slaves, then he was able to both increase the tax base and also weaken the economic and military support of the local warlords. He also enacted the civil service examination system, which began at this time and lasted then for centuries throughout the Joseon dynasty. This was a recruitment system to recruit government officials. But how does this enhance the power of the king? Well, who's setting the standards? It's the king. Who is determining the content of the exam? Ultimately, it's the king. So by the king controlling the content of what future government officials are learning, this increases the power of the king. King Seongjong, who was the sixth king of Koryo, he set up the 12 provinces. And what he did was he began to dispatch central government officials from the capital to the local governments. And so this is the first time that we see the administration of local governments by central government officials. He also abolished all private armies. And this was a big step to increase the power of the throne because, as I had said, Wanggeon had come to power through the support of the local warlords. Now Seongdeong is taking away the warlords' private armies. So these private armies are all abolished, and this really defangs the local warlords. All right, so if we look at the geopolitical situation, the Khitan who had conquered Pare, the Pare who then begin to flee from this northern area. Many of them come into the peninsula, and Wanggeon welcomes them, and he even appointed some of them as officials. And so what we have then now is Koryo coming into conflict with the Khitans at this northern border. In 993, the Khitan invade Koryo, and again in 1018. So as political rule is solidified with Koryo, the Khitans are then overtaken by the Jurchen. And so then they come into conflict with the Koryo dynasty. They also come into conflict with the Song dynasty. So after the fall of the Tang dynasty, and then it's in disarray, they then consolidate again and they form the Song dynasty. But the Jurchens, or the Jin dynasty, they come into conflict with both the Song dynasty and with Koryo. In 1127, they are able to capture the Song capital. So the Koryo dynasty had relations with the Song dynasty, and it had been sending official embassies. They had been sending merchants. There was a certain amount of trade, but there was increasing conflict with both the Khitans and the Jurchens. And the Song dynasty at some point had wanted to invade, but and wanted the Koryo dynasty to help them invade, but the Koryo dynasty said, no, thank you, we'll stay out of this one. By the mid-Koryo dynasty, we have a rebellion. So at this point, because we have civil officials and military officials in the government, the civil officials had much more prestige than military officials. In fact, the military officials were looked down upon. And so in 1170, the military officials revolt. They kill a whole bunch of civil officials and try to purge them. And this begins military rule during the Koryo dynasty. And military rule is taken over by the Choi household, led by Choi Chumon. And he is then ruling in a military fashion. At the same time, what we have is the rise of the Mongols. So by the time we get to the late Koryo dynasty, the Mongols have now established this huge empire in the area. And, they are a nomadic, horse-riding, militaristic peoples. And you've heard of Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan. Well, they are able to establish this massive empire. And it's really quite impressive. Genghis Khan had a retinue of personal bodyguards numbering of 80 to 100,000 men. And so he had these very close personal bonds of loyalty between them, but he dies. And when he dies, again, there's no clear successor to this great empire. And so his empire then gets broken up into 4 different parts. And these 4 different parts basically end up becoming an empire in the area of Russia, in Central Asia, and Persia, and then in East Asia. And the empire in East Asia becomes the Yuan dynasty. So we have then now these Mongols who are attacking Koryo, and they attack Koryo for 30 years. And what is what the Mongols were known for was when they would attack, they would come in, and not only would they rape and pillage and steal, but they would also burn everything down. So you can imagine that after 30 years of this, and 30 years of this kinds of attacks, most of the peninsula of Koryo was devastated. So finally, Koryo falls to the Mongols in 1258. So we have the establishment of this Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Yuan dynasty here, and they have attacked the Koryo dynasty, but they do not take over. So they subjugate the Koryo dynasty, and the Mongols, they want to continue their expansion into Japan. So they force Koryo to participate in expeditions against Japan. And this is very costly for the Koryo dynasty because they have to provide all kinds of supplies. They have to provide soldiers, they have to provide food, they have to make ships, and this is very costly for the Koryo dynasty. But what ends up happening is instead of the Mongols just outright taking over, they create what is called like a son-in-law country or a son-in-law nation. So the Koryo royal family then is intermarried with the Mongol imperial family. What usually happened was the Koryo crown prince would marry a Mongol princess. So when you have crown prince, he's born. He's then sent to the Mongol capital, and he's raised in the Mongol capital. When he comes of age, he's married to a Mongol princess, and then when it's his time to succeed and take over the throne, he's sent back to Koryo, and he takes over the kingship. And so we have these Koryo kings who rule with Mongol backing. The Mongols are able to control Koryo by intermarriage, but they also they reorganize the bureaucracy and the government. So all terms are downgraded. So the Mongol emperor is the emperor, but the Koryo king is just a king. And all government administrative organizations are either downgraded, restructured, combined, or abolished. And the results are that we still have a Koryo king and a Koryo ruler, but they are operating under certain restraints and conciliation. And so what this then means is that this is an opportunity for the civil aristocracy to reassert itself, because as we just discussed, the military officials had staged, this coup basically, and they had killed off a whole bunch of civil officials, and they had taken over power and established a military government. But with the Mongols taking over and the military being suppressed, this now provides an opportunity for the civil officials to reassert themselves. So there's a struggle between the throne, for power between the throne and the aristocracy, as they try to reassert power. And then we have King Kongmin. So King Kongmin is a king at the end of the dynasty. And at this point, the Yuan or the Mongols are being driven out of the Chinese mainland. And we have a rising Ming dynasty. And so King Kongmin is anti-Mongol and pro-Ming, which is very interesting given the fact that by this point we have generations of Koryo kings whose mothers are Mongols. But he is anti-Mongol. Internally within Koryo, he tries to suppress the powerful families. And after the Ming dynasty successfully drives out the Mongols, he takes a very pro-Ming stance. And after doing this, he uses this obscure monk, Shindon, and he tries to implement sweeping reform, like returning land and slaves to their rightful owners. And the aristocracy's response is not positive. You know, they don't like their power and their wealth being taken away. And so he's killed, Shindon is killed, King Gongmin is killed. And what we have then is, you know, within Koryo, pressure from the Ming, because the Ming have not only driven out the Mongols, but they're also expanding their empire in this direction. So Koryo's northern border, there's conflict between the Ming and Koryo. There's also still the problem of piracy, of Japanese pirates. But because of this external pressure, you know, this rising Ming dynasty and the Japanese pirates, the military commanders become more important because we have to defend the dynasty. And so we have the rise of military commanders within Koryo. All right, what is happening in Japan during this time? Well, basically we're looking at the late Heian period, and there's a conflict of power between these two groups. And we also have eventually, you know, this conflict that arises between the retired emperor and the acting emperor. And so this leads to the Genpei War in Heian, Japan. And after the end of the Genpei War, the shogunate is established, and this is a military government. So we have a shogun who is the head military guy, and he is operating outside of Edo, which is current-day Tokyo, but he leaves the emperor in Kyoto. So he lets the emperor stay in Kyoto, but the emperor essentially becomes just a figurehead. So it's really the shogun who is running the show, and he is working with the local warlords, the daimyo, in all of these different areas. And the daimyo have to demonstrate their loyalty to the shogun, and they do this by visiting the shogun on a regular basis. So they have to travel to Tokyo. If you live within the closer regions, this is not a big deal. But if you live in these outer areas, it's a very far way to travel. All right, so this is the end of this week's lecture. And please check online for the discussion questions.